All right, Gospel, we are going to finish up week 11 of Second Corinthians and hopefully give you one more session closer to finishing the study. As we wrapped up last time, we were together, which was, man, it seems like such a long time ago. It was a few weeks ago, and we finished up chapter 11. And so today we're going to be at the end of chapter 11 and the beginning of chapter 12. So if you want to get out your notes, your notebook from Second Corinthians study, or if you want to take out just a piece of paper and take a couple of notes here, hopefully you've read through this section as it was homework from our last week, and you're ready to look at this together. Now, we won't take quite as much time as we normally would in a regular Sunday school class because as you've been in class with me, you know we like to do a lot of interaction and a lot of question and answer, whether it's me questioning you or you asking me questions. Not sure who was going to be the designated questioner this week, but hopefully you'll all sort of take up that challenge and ask yourself some questions as we go through this text. And then you can, Lord willing, study on your own and find those. So how many of you remember Popeye? I love Popeye. Popeye was awesome as a kid to watch those commercials or to watch that show and see him always get beat up and beat down. And then at some point, him as the underdog, he would turn things and he would eat a spinach and he would get strong and he would beat up whoever or fix whatever or save whoever. But there was always something that he said. He always got to a certain point where he had been getting beat up or his girlfriend was in distress or something was falling apart and he was taking abuse. But at some point, he would always stop. And there was something he said right before he popped that can of spinach. He would stop and say, "That's all I can stand. I can't stand no more." And then he'd pop that can of spinach. His arms would get all big and he'd go out and he'd win and he'd fight. Well, here in Second Corinthians chapter 11, I think we hit the point where Paul has come to say, "That's all I can stand. I can't stand no more." And he gets to this point where, if you remember from our last study, he had said, "Now you're going to have to let me be foolish for a little bit." He told the Corinthians, he says, I'm going to now talk to you. I'm going to approach you the way you've received these false apostles. And it's really been foolishness on your part, but to show you that even if I came the way they did, I would still be superior to them. He says, I'm going to engage in a little foolishness. I'm going to speak to you in a way that I really wouldn't normally, but in this special situation, I'm going to for just a little while. And so he told them he's going to give them a little folly or a little foolishness. And he goes into some things about the false apostles, and we saw how tricky they were, how absolutely deceptive these servants of Satan had been. And that's why the church at Corinth had let them in, is because they weren't prepared to deal with such deceptive trickery. And so as Paul gets to chapter 11 and verse 22, he begins, and this is where he now is going to list out, as if he were one of those false apostles. He's going to go to them and he's going to say, "Now listen, if I were going to come to you the way these guys came to you, these are the things that I would have to say." Basically, to this point, Paul has been silent. He's not defended himself. And the false apostles have come in and they've attacked and they've given their boastings. They've talked about, "Hey, here are my credentials. Here are all the people." Got some hair hanging out back here. "Here are all the people that say that I'm a great guy." And Paul says, "Well, look here, if I came to you that way, then boy, you'd really be surprised at the things that I'd be able to list out for you." And he says, "But we're exercising a little foolishness here, but I'm going to go ahead and do that for you." And so he gets into this. And now let's remember, Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 2 says, "Let another man praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips." So it is very clear from Scripture that we are not to enter into situations or conversations and boast about how good we are, to tell people how great we are, to give people all the things that we've accomplished and done, to tell them all the different reasons they should listen to us. In other words, we're not to build ourselves up. but Paul here does. So why is that not a contradiction? Because he's saying to them, I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth here, but I'm not tricking you by doing it. The false apostles have. I'm letting you know that I'm doing it so that you're not tricked, but I want to make 2 points here. He says, I want to make the point that I would beat the false apostles if I came to you their way. But by the way, that's foolishness. That's really not how anybody should approach you. And so he's making 2 points, but he's being very different than the false apostles because he's not being tricky about it. He's telling them right up front, this is what I'm going to do. And then as he starts into it, he says, hey, by the way, remember, I'm giving you what I shouldn't. I'm being foolish here. So the first thing that we see is Paul's suffering is itemized. Paul's suffering is itemized. He goes through and he gives a whole list of the things that he has suffered. And I want you to think here as we go through, if you were, and this was your homework to think about, if you were to give a list of all the things that you've suffered as a Christian, all the things that you've had to endure because of serving Jesus Christ. Now, not somebody was mean to you because they didn't like you, or you didn't get the sale price that you wanted on your favorite shirt, or not those kinds of things, but the things that you've specifically experienced because you've been serving Jesus, because of your Christianity, because of the gospel. What have you suffered? And can you list anything? I would dare say most of us as American Christians probably can't list much that would fall into that category. But Paul here, he says, now, as I itemize these things, number one, I'm going to tell you stuff that we have in common. There's things that I have in common with these other false apostles. He says, verse 22, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? And this is again where he makes sure and tells them, hey, look, remember, I'm approaching you in a weird way here. He says, I speak as a fool. Are they ministers of Christ? I am more. So what he says is there's some things we have in common. They're Hebrews, they're Israelites, they're the seed of Abraham. They claim to be ministers of Christ. He says we have that in common. So it's not that everything about us is completely different, but he says, as he gets to verse 23, though we both claim to be ministers of Christ, he says, I am more of a minister of Christ. And you say, well, wait a minute, Paul, that sounds like bragging. Yes, it is. And that's what he's telling him. I'm going to do this foolish thing to make a point with you. But as he goes on and he says, I am more, he's not just boasting, he's actually right. He's actually being truthful. He's actually being pretty blunt and bold, but honest. He actually has way more credentials as a servant of Christ than those other guys do. So according to Paul, what are the evidences of a servant of Christ? What are the evidences that he is more an apostle of the gospel than they are? Well, it's his suffering. So Paul has some things in common with the false apostles. Now he's going to itemize his suffering that's unique to him. And I want you to think about this list. This is not him making up things that could happen. This is not him giving a list of all the things that happened to the men of the Old Testament. This is not all the stuff that happens to Christians somewhere. This is the stuff that happened to Paul. He goes on to say, in labors more abundant, in stripes or whipping above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. Now, what does that mean? Well, in being whipped, you could be whipped by the Romans, and there was no limit to how many times they could whip you. Or if the Jewish guard were to whip you, then they had a limit under the Old Testament to make sure that they weren't murdering somebody. They had to whip you 40 times minus 1. In other words, 39 lashes was okay. 40 was considered to be deadly. And so if they were whipping somebody, they had to do 39 times. He says, I have faced the Jewish whipping 5 times. 5 times Paul has been taken by the Jews and lashed 39 times. Man, that's a lot. Verse 25. He says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. 3 different situations he was in he got into a circumstance where his punishment to try to get him to turn aside from Christ and to not serve the gospel anymore was to beat him with rods. He says, once I was stoned. Now, what does that mean to be stoned? Well, there was a specific series of things that were done to somebody. There were a couple of different ways they could stone somebody. It wasn't just like dodgeball from elementary school, where you were supposed to stand out in the middle of a field and people threw rocks at you and tried to see if they could hit you. No, there was a specific series of things designed to kill a person. And he says, there was one time I was stoned. And I believe we can read about this in the book of Acts. And what we read is that they left him for dead. They were convinced that he was dead. And many scholars believe that Paul actually was dead, but God gave him his life back. God actually resurrected him from that being stoned to death time. Verse 25, 3 times I was shipwrecked. And that wasn't just Paul having bad luck. That was Satan trying to stop the gospel. There were 3 times he was on missions journeys and was shipwrecked because he was trying to travel to those places. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In other words, he was floating out at sea all day and all night as a part of one of those shipwrecks, trying to survive. Verse 26, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen. In other words, even my Jewish fellow nationals attack me, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren. He goes through and he says, basically, no matter where I go, whether it's there or there, there or there, up there or down there, anywhere I go, everywhere I go, I am in peril because I serve Jesus, because of the message of the gospel. He goes on, verse 27, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. He says there's all kinds of weariness that comes on me physically, not just these spiritual attacks and not just people coming against me in different times and opportunities. He says every way you can imagine for somebody to be attacked, to be worn down, to have to suffer. He says, I've done that. I've been through that. And in fact, I probably pretty often he's been through these things. So Paul itemizes his suffering. Now, you may look at this and think, no, wait a minute, why does this necessitate that he's doing these things for Jesus? Why is it necessarily because of Christ that this is all happening to him? Well, if we were to look in John chapter 15, I'm going to turn over there. In John chapter 15, Jesus is speaking to, you see, a true servant of Christ is going to suffer in this world. It is a mark of being a true servant of Jesus that we suffer. And Paul goes through here and he lists out his sufferings. He goes through and he gives all these different ways and times and places and even counts the number of some of the major ones. And he says, these all give evidence that I am more, back to verse 23, a minister of Christ than these false guys are. You see, you look at their lives and everything's cushy and easy and nice and pleasant. Well, why? How is it that they can live in this world as a servant of Jesus and everything be great and fine? It may be that they're not really a servant of Jesus. Number 2, if you're taking notes, is Paul's suffering is individualized. He gives all these things specifically about his sufferings, and now he wants to tell them, he says, now there's something that I have that they can't share in. There's something that I've suffered in that they can't match up with. And he says this in verse 28. He says, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily? My deep concern for all the churches. You see, Paul had planted these churches. He was a spiritual father to many of these people. He had seen those Christians come from spiritual darkness to spiritual light, and then he established that church and he helped that church get going. And so his heart, his mind, his passion now being away from those locations is those churches are healthy and those churches continue to grow. He says those false apostles can't do that. They've never planted those churches. They've not traveled and started something from nothing in a place where the gospel had never been. He said they don't share in that with me. He says that's something though that I wrestle with daily. I struggle with daily. Not wrestle to get rid of, but just that weight and that burden on his mind and on his heart. He says I have this, and it's something they don't share in. And then thirdly, Paul says that he's going to boast a little bit, but he's going to limit it. Even in these boastings of all the ways that he's suffered because he serves Jesus in the gospel, he says, even in boasting, I'm going to limit what I say. Now you may think, well, wait a minute, what else could he possibly have to boast in? Well, if you think about it, up to this point, Paul's told us about all the bad stuff. He's told us about all the negative things in his life and in his ministry. He's told us about all the things that we would hear and go, ooh, I don't know if I want any of that or not. And now Paul begins to talk about why he's going to stop here. Why is he not going to boast in all the accomplishments that he's had? Why is he not going to boast about all the good things? Why is he not going to build himself up in how great and wonderful he is? So Paul limits the boasts. He says in verse 29 and 30, who is weak? And I am not weak. Who is made to stumble? And I do not burn with indignation. If I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmity. He says, now I've boasted to you, and I really shouldn't. That's not the right way to approach it. But I've told you I'm going to, and there's a reason why, just in this limited circumstance, the false apostles and foolishness and all that, and the trickery. He says, but now that I've done that and I've made my case, he says, I'm only going to do it insofar as my infirmities. I'm not even going to go into any accomplishments. Well, why would he do that? Well, he goes on to say, if I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmity. The God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. Well, first of all, he says, before I explain this to you, he says, I want you to know that I didn't embellish any of that. All that negative stuff, he says, is all true. It's all factual. It's all honest. I haven't built any of it up. I haven't told a fishing story. You know what I mean? He says, I haven't expanded anything to be more than it was. He said, I've just given you very honest, plain, blunt truth. And then he goes on and he says, he limits the boasts by necessity. So he goes in the rest of that in verse 32. In Damascus, the governor under Aretas the king was guarding the city Damascenes with a garrison desiring to arrest me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands. So he gives some specifics of one particular circumstance to say, hey, look, God knows this is all factual, honest, true. And then chapter 12, verse 1, it is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, and he begins to tell about this man. Now, most scholars believe that Paul here is telling them about his own experience, but in order to not boast and build himself up, he says, I know a guy who, kind of like you see nowadays, people ask a question on Facebook or social media, and at the end they put asking for a friend. Yeah, that's their way of telling you, I'm asking, but I don't want you to know it's for me, so I'm asking for a friend, but really it's for them. Paul here says, I'm going to tell you about my friend, a man that I know. He says, whether in the body, I do not know, or whether out of the body, I do not know, God knows. Such a one was caught up into the third heaven. In other words, this person got to see heaven like where God lives. First heaven is, earth. Second heaven is universe and stars. Third heaven is where God lives. He says this guy was caught up into the third heaven. Now, I don't know if it was just God let him see it in his mind as a vision, or if this guy actually was bodily transported to where God is, but this guy got to go to the third heaven. And I know such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows, how he was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast, except in my infirmities. He says, look, I've got all of this stuff that I could tell you, and I know all these people that have had fantastic experiences. My friend got caught up into the third heaven. He says, but I'm not going to put myself there. I'm not going to tell you about all those things for me, except for in my infirmities. Now, it might sound really strange, but he goes on in verse 6 to explain this to him. He says, for though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth. But I refrain lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. As I say, and he says, I want you to go back to the same rule I've always had, and that is to examine my life. Judge me by the gospel that I preach. He says, I could tell you all these things, but they don't change the gospel message that I bring to you. Either I'm bringing you biblical truth and God uses me to grow you and build you up, and you know that, and so that's what I'm going to be built up by, or you don't, and it doesn't matter what else I tell you because I'm not being effective for the ministry of the kingdom. He goes on in verses 7 through 10, and he talks about this thorn in the flesh that's taught him how to boast in his infirmities. A very strange thing for us to think about today, but he says, here's the reason that I boast in my infirmities. He says, unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations. In other words, all the awesome stuff God has done in my life and all the cool things I've experienced. He says, that could build me up. But to make sure that it doesn't, he says, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. God, please take this thing away. Whether it's a person that's a thorn in the flesh, or a job, or a physical infirmity, people believe Paul actually had a physical issue, whether it's a physical sickness, whatever it is, he says, I pleaded with God 3 times, God, please take this thing away. And every time, verse 9, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. He says, I'll boast about my infirmities, because you see, in my infirmities, Christ has to come in and he gets glory. He said, I'll tell you about those because Jesus gets the attention. Jesus gets to be lifted up. He says, I'm not going to boast about my good things, because then you're going to think more highly of me when it doesn't really matter. He says, but there's this thorn in the flesh that came along, and God did it so that he could teach me this lesson, that his grace is sufficient for me. And it's in my infirmities, and it's in your infirmities, that Jesus is able to come in and be known in a more powerful way. Verse 10, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul says, look, there's a reason that I won't boast, and it's because of my infirmities. That's when Jesus gets to come in. So let me ask you a question as we're following along with Paul writing to the church at Corinth. What would be your testimony of being a true servant of Jesus? What would be my list of things that I've had to suffer as a true servant of Christ? If we were to look at the list of the things that we've gone through and endured because of being a servant of the gospel, because of being a person who follows Jesus, if we were to list out all the things we'd had to suffer because of that, what kind of list would we come up with? Would we have a list as long as Paul's? Would we have a list at all? Scripture tells us that if the world hates us, it's going to mistreat us, and that if we follow Jesus, it's going to hate us. So I wonder, what is the evidence of following Christ in our lives? What sort of infirmities have we had to deal with so that Christ could be exalted and Christ could be put forward? This is a very interesting passage by Paul, but it calls us to think, what evidence is there that I've really done much for Jesus? Do you want to serve God? Great. Do you want to be used greatly by God? Awesome. Are you willing to go through the suffering that comes with that? Maybe not. The pastor that hired me straight out of Bible college down in Columbus, Bob Burney, I'll never forget one of the first weeks that I was on staff there in the office down in the church in Columbus. I walked in and I sat down and I was talking with him, and he said, Stephen, before God can greatly use you, he has to break you. And I thought, oh boy, sounds like fun. I'll never forget him telling that. And it sounded very discouraging and very negative, but in fact, he was being very helpful and letting me know that God is going to do great things through people, but first he has to bring them to the point where they glory in their infirmities. They recognize Jesus. And in order to get us to recognize the greatness of Christ, often God has to let us be worn down and broken down to our very root, base self, where we realize I am so in need of Jesus every day. And Paul had gone through that. So can you list any? If people gossiped about you, people mistreated you, if people unfriended you, whether on Facebook or in life, have you lost any relationships? Have you lost any jobs? Has it cost you any money? Has there been any suffering that you've had to endure because of following Jesus? I don't say this to scare us or to try to make us look for negativity in our lives, but to realize that when negativity comes, it may very well be specifically because it has to if we're a faithful servant of Jesus. Now, our last study is going to be in the remainder of the book of 2 Corinthians. And so 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 11 through chapter 13 and verse 14. And as you read that between now and sometime next week when I put the last of our series videos up, what does Paul tell them about his next visit? I don't know if you've ever, if you remember as a kid, maybe mom and dad saying, now, when I get back, and they always had something they wanted you to remember. Or you get home from school and there'd be a note on the counter. And when I get home, here's what needs to be done. Well, Paul says, well, when I come again, when I get back, what does he tell them? What does he say to them about his next visit? What does he give them to work on between now and the next time that he sees them? So read over that text, the rest of 2 Corinthians, and we'll look forward to seeing you, or actually, I guess I won't get to see you, but you seeing me as we wrap up this study in 2 Corinthians.